Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin with news on Europe and how the second wave of the CCP virus has swept across the continent, leading to just as many deaths at this point in time as the first wave. You would think that having already dealt with it once, and having knocked their numbers of daily deaths down to less than 100 a day, Europe would be far better prepared. Instead, during this second wave, they are now at a point above where they were at the peak of the first wave. That is 4,082 deaths a day, admittedly only slightly above the 4,081 deaths a day. This number comes despite some of the countries in Europe engaging in extreme lockdown measures, having innovated and supported their healthcare systems in having the best possible preparations. The devastation and damage from that first wave made people aware of what needed to be done and how best to do it. Yet despite this, we are seeing a second wave as bad, if not possibly worse, than what the first was. It's worth noting that no country seems to be following the same pattern as the first wave. Some countries are being hit worse than they were the first time. Some were being hit less harshly the second time. And yet there are other countries which were largely unaffected during the first wave and now seeing skyrocketing daily cases than they did the first time around. This is creating a number of issues, and at least one of these is that people have been pushing to reopen. Yet reopening during a second wave like this could be just as much of a problem as if they had not reopened at all. In fact, it could be worse. The simple reality is that reopening during the second wave means that we may be in the midst of a season where this becomes such an issue that there is no way to effectively control it. This surge in cases is best exemplified by how Sweden has had to deal with it. The ICU beds in Swedish hospitals in Stockholm are now at 99% capacity. That is, for every 100 beds in an ICU in Stockholm, 99 of them are taken up with a patient. That means they effectively have no more capacity. They can take on one more patient and that is it. This is a big issue. ICU beds are often used for those who are on ventilators and other critical support, things that are necessary and essential for CCP virus patients. If they are severely infected, the ability to breathe and go on living is almost impossible without the intensive care unit support. This is especially true if they are elderly or have comorbidities. The region's health and medical care director is quoted as saying, "We need help." It needs to be noted that Sweden is one of the countries that did not follow the almost universal norm of bringing in strict social distancing measures and limiting the movement of people. There was no lockdown, there was no limitations. They tried to take a natural immunity approach. Enough people would become infected that eventually the country would become resilient, or more accurately immune. As was noted, not only did this fail the first time during that first wave where they were hit hard, but now during the second wave, they're being hit hard again. They have over 300,000 active cases and over 7,000 deaths, all directly tied to the CCP virus. This is in a country of just over 10 million people. While Sweden was previously unwilling to engage in measures comparable to a lockdown, or otherwise inhibit people from going about what they want to do themselves and having some self-autonomy, the Swedish government is now seeking approval to begin closing down public places like malls and gyms in an effort to slow down the spread of the virus. It would appear the government even recognizes that it is unlikely to be able to stop the spread at this rate. They also note that they've seen no evidence of herd immunity. Herd immunity is one thing that was thought to possibly be a holy grail. if a vaccine could not be made, or worse yet, if a vaccine was taking too long to come to market. Vaccines themselves continue to be a concern, particularly as several of the drugs have recently run into hurdles. One of these is that the AstraZeneca and Oxford University trials have some issues. You may wonder, what was this issue? Well, in short, they were seeking approval from the FDA. This is fairly standard practice. The problem is that they did not make the FDA aware of the fact that they had halted just about all of their clinical trials across the world after a patient fell ill in Britain. This lack of disclosure and transparency is a big problem. If you're going to a regulator and you're saying, we would like to bring this drug to market, you've already given us over $1 billion to not only finance the development, but also purchase the drug that we're manufacturing, but we're not going to tell you about this adverse event, you're not engendering any kind of support or approval by that agency. The other issue is it undermines your efforts in the eyes of the public. Trust with the FDA has been further hampered by AstraZeneca's very slow response in providing data about other adverse events. According to reports, there were at least 2 clinical trial participants who developed neurological symptoms. The FDA naturally was concerned about the number of people who could develop neurological problems if this proved to be a pattern. AstraZeneca's slow response in providing data in response to that concern means that the drug was further delayed, particularly in deploying clinical trials in America. This means that they've already had issues with getting the kind of support and working cooperative relationship with the FDA that would be necessary for approval, and now they've gone and bitten the hand that feeds them in another instance. This is just one example of what has been happening and how concerns about the drug itself have hampered efforts to bring it to market, and specifically getting approval. The lack of transparency and honesty with the FDA has been part of a larger pattern with that particular drug manufacturing company, AstraZeneca. It's not the only news about a vaccine at the moment. Another one was coming out of Australia. It was a collaborative effort between the University of Queensland and CSL, the Australian serum manufacturing conglomerate. The issues they've had were so severe that they've now had to abandon their clinical trials. In short, their vaccine relied on HIV as the backbone of how the virus would be delivered and rally the immune system. They had modified the HIV virus so that it would no longer work as HIV, nor would it be infectious in that manner. This is not a novel technique, and there are others who are looking at using the same system, and the concerns we're seeing now with that could also apply to those vaccines. The reason the University of Queensland and CSL vaccine trials have been stopped entirely, if not abandoned outright, is that they were causing people to develop positive serological tests to having HIV. That's a pretty serious thing to have come up. While yes, it's true that they don't appear to have HIV, and that they do have antibodies to the CCP virus, the issue is that the vaccine could be issues, and particularly if people begin testing positive for HIV and all those false positives start showing up. In Australia, you have about 25 million people, a large proportion of which would receive the vaccine, and if suddenly a large proportion of the population starts testing positive for HIV, you have a significant issue. Having a vaccine that is going to produce these sorts of false positive results in a completely unrelated disease is a concern and would damage the confidence in the vaccine system, just as badly as AstraZeneca damaged the FDA's confidence in their efforts. Another concern at the moment is that the Pfizer vaccine appears to have issues with people being allergic to some element of it. This drug is coming out of the UK in particular, and the UK regulatory agency has advised people who are at risk of a significant allergic event, such as anaphylaxis, to not have the vaccine at this stage. Unlike the other vaccine news so far, this has been specifically isolated and associated with those people who have a significant history of very strong allergic reactions, and there were only 2 such people in the study who did react to the vaccine. This means it is possible that, like some other vaccines that are out there may be a medical reason underlying why that vaccine should not be used with those people. It is worth noting that between the placebo arm and the trial arm of the clinical trial, there was less than a 0.12% difference in the people who had adverse reactions. This ranges from headaches and discomfort through to something as serious as those severe allergic reactions. The upside to those numbers is quite simply that for the vast percentage of the population, this means the vaccine is not only entirely safe, as far as we can tell at this stage, but would appear to be very efficacious. We also have this rather entertaining take on one of the more unexpected and possibly unrelated, but also possibly related, side effects of infection by the CCP virus. The joke being that it causes erectile dysfunction, and that focusing on someone's penis and ability to have sex could be the most effective public health initiative used to advertise the vaccine and encourage people to utilize it. While it is true aiming to people's carnal desires is relatively effective in marketing, it may not be the most reliable approach, given that at times evidence supporting some of the conclusions for the CCP virus and various interventions has been nothing short of lacking. Moving on from the CCP virus to yet another mystery illness, and hopefully one that does not spread as readily as the CCP virus. India is currently dealing with a mysterious illness. It's currently led to hundreds of people being hospitalized and at least 1 death. The concern that they have is that they don't know what the illness is, although testing would indicate that it has something to do with lead and nickel, given that they are very high amounts in patients' blood. Symptoms include things like nausea, fits, and fainting. It is established that the disease itself doesn't appear to have any crossover or relationship with the CCP virus, which is at least one small favor. Much to our surprise, the World Health Organization has already deployed health experts to India to help deal with this disease or outbreak, which is far faster and more efficacious intervention than they had with the CCP virus. Hopefully we'll know more soon, although there appears to be some disagreement as to whether or not the blood test results fit with the disease or are an unrelated phenomenon that's been observed, with different politicians fielding the question differently. Going now from diseases, or at least away from diseases that are inexplicable, we now have some initial results from trials of using dogs to identify carriers who have the CCP virus. We've mentioned previously that dogs are being used at different airports in an effort to detect carriers of the CCP virus. There have been trials in the past to use them to detect cancer. They are regularly used for drugs, explosives, and more. This then gives rise to why not try and train dogs to try and detect who has the CCP virus. This has been done in Sweden, France, Lebanon, and other countries. This has been surprisingly easy. It takes a day or less for many dogs to be trained to identify the scent. They can then be deployed effectively. This means one dog can easily screen many travelers very quickly. They also have a rather high rate of success, hovering at a point around 75%. That is 3/4 on average. Some were significantly better at a nearly perfect 100% accuracy. In other news of animals that, at least in this instance, might make you a little bit queasy. Deep sea fish have been recorded devouring sharks whole. It is, in many cases, a fish-eat-fish world, rather than a dog-eat-dog world. In the depths of the ocean, this is more so than ever. In fact, it's one of the most hierarchical places in the world, with the largest creatures feeding on those smaller than them. What's interesting is actually seeing how the animals interact and the predatory behaviors that happen at that deep level of the sea. There is little light, there's high pressure, and there's not a lot to go on, other than the ability to quickly act on opportunity to eat another creature. Going now from the predatory behavior of animals, we can go down to the predatory behavior of the immune cells in the human body. Immune cells in the human body need to find a way to access where pathogens live once they've entered the human host. This is often very hard, as the immune cell has to go from the arteries into capillaries, travel through this into the tissue, and then get to where the pathogen is. This is often quite a long process, and often involves a very large cell trying to squish its way through very tightly packed, very small cells. In order for this to happen, the immune cells need to effectively tunnel their way through the tissue to get to where they're going to have their action and help to protect you from that pathogen. That is where both an amazing and somewhat disconcerting video comes in. The video is of a lymphocyte, specifically a T lymphocyte, doing exactly that, working its way through the tissue by creating a tunnel, and then it captures the foreign pathogen. This is all part of the body's immune system and something that we're still working on understanding, as there are many diseases and autoimmune problems that we simply aren't able to understand at this stage. Something we're still not entirely sure of, although we are working on body literature that explains it, is just how these cells migrate from the capillaries through the tissue to get to their work site. This research is based on an artificial model, but it would appear to be in line with what we might expect to see in a living organism, although it would be hopeful that they could replicate their results in a more robust model of the concepts that we're looking at here. In some astronomy-related news, SpaceX has had several successes this week. This begins with the deployment of one of their rocket ships and then it landing, and had it crash. SpaceX has a bit of a rocky history when it comes to successfully deploying rockets. In the early days, a number of them caught on fire while still on the launch pad. Meanwhile, they've also had some stunning success. They've been able to get astronauts into space, ship supplies to the International Space Station, and so on. The accident occurring here appears to be a result of the attempted re-landing of the rocket. The theory behind these is that they should be reusable rockets. They can be sent up, come back down, and land safely. In this case, the process was relatively simple. The rocket engines went out one by one until none remained. It then wound up in its right position. They then initially reactivated the rocket engines to try and slow down the landing. Not enough so, leading to the crash. The final news we have this week is tech related, specifically YouTube technology related. YouTube has at least somewhat announced a new series of rules that they have regarding YouTube video content, specifically about the election. YouTube has stated they will now remove clips from videos and even entire videos, and in some cases entire channels, if they talk about the election in a particular way. Specifically, that they will remove content that includes any references to fraud. This is an interesting position for YouTube to take, particularly since they're owned by Alphabet, which was what Google formerly operated as. Alphabet now owns Google, YouTube, and a variety of other platforms. We use the word platform because it is very important in relation to this. YouTube and other online services are protected from lawsuits for slander and more under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or the DMCA. This had a very specific and very niche protection for them carved out. That protection was that so long as they were a platform and were not directly editing the content of their service or platform, that they would not be considered a publisher of anything. This meant that they were not liable for the content. The issue is they are increasingly editing and very carefully selecting the content of their platform. This means they are coming ever closer to falling afoul of that Section 230 protection. They're already under the very watchful eye of several Senate committee hearings who believe that they are not acting in good faith. If they were to lose the Section 230 protection, it could be a massive issue not only for YouTube, but a variety of other platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. The worry here is that it came out in a blog post. This has not been an update to the terms of service and so on. Without having changed the terms of service and the various other very vague limitations and instructions given to YouTube's creators, this could be seen as election interference. Considering that at the moment it looks like YouTube may have difficulties in Germany with its creators, this is yet another issue that YouTube appears to be making for itself, another rod for their own back. In Germany, there is push for laws to be passed, and which are already being tabled in their government agencies and parliament, to make it so that creators for YouTube are not independent agents, independent contractors, or independent employees who do not work directly for YouTube. Rather, they would be defined as being employed by YouTube and vicariously by Alphabet. This means that in Germany, and if this were to be brought to other countries, Google and YouTube would be responsible for things like health insurance, payments to funds for retirement, healthcare, sick leave, personal leave, holiday leave, and to provide them with a wage. There is a very strong chance that if Germany passes this law, that other European Union countries will do the same. Given that the European Union makes up a very large percentage of Alphabet's market for advertising and more, they may not have a choice as to whether or not they want to accept these new laws and have to deal with them the best way they can. This would be similar to how the GDPR, or General Data Protection and Regulation Acts, had the impact they did on not just Alphabet, Google, and YouTube, but in fact the entire internet. In some cases, you may still be feeling the implications of this impact. There was, until recently, a massive surge in the number of websites that would ask you to approve things like cookies and caching to track your actions. This was because after the GDPR was brought in, they were required to get that approval. Since this new law very specifically says that YouTube would not be permitted to change the terms of service or any of the guidelines without a formal process, and that these formal processes would need to be tested by an independent judge, both for what they were and what they were changing, it could significantly pressure YouTube into changing the way they've currently structured their system. With that final piece of news, that's all we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you might have below.